Hello and welcome back to Perspectives, bringing you our daily dose of news and views covering the topics we hope are relevant to you. Today, we discuss a statement just released by the UK's first female Sikh MP. We look at how Modi's government seems to be encouraging violence even amongst Hindus in India. And we look at what's being called by Sikhs in Punjab a black day, that of Independence Day today. And in Canada, hate crimes on the increase and alarm bells sound over modern-day slavery of immigrant workers. Well, joining me as always for Perspectives is our very own correspondent in Canada, James Cousineau. Good morning, James.
Good morning, Angus, and good morning to all of our amazing viewers out there.
Indeed, and together we'll be bringing you our perspectives on the daily news affecting the Sikh community across the world. And of course, as usual, we'll be taking a look at lots of your great comments at the end of the show, which have been filling up beneath our videos. So thanks very much indeed for those. So James, let's start the show off. What have you got for us today?
Well, some feathers have been ruffled here in Canada. The United Nations has actually come out with a report, and it is not good. It essentially is looking at the Canadian Foreign Worker Program here in Canada and essentially calling it modern day slavery. Now, although there are a lot of issues that the minister responsible acknowledges, what they are very offended by is, as I said, calling for them to reference it as modern day slavery is quite inflammatory, according to the politicians. Now, this is something that we've touched on in the past, and that is the types of abuse that foreign workers here in Canada are subjected to. Now, it's physical abuse is actually one of the things, but also theft of pay, people being shortchanged on their pay, as well as other issues that come up, overworked, unsafe working conditions, and threats constantly over their head of being canceled in terms of their work permits and being sent back home. It just goes on. And one of the richest families in the Lower Mainland in British Columbia, who actually own one of the major sports teams here, has also been found guilty of providing unsafe transportation, where they have been fined over and over again and vehicles pulled off the road because they are not showing the responsibility of transporting workers in roadworthy vehicles that meet the current motor vehicle safety regulations. So as I said, these are just a small number of the abuses that are going on, and the UN is looking at it and really giving a eye-opening judgment on it to the Canadian politicians. But it's something that people have been aware of for quite some time, and something that, as I said, Angus, we've touched on previously. Now, the minister, Mark Miller, said he objects to the phrase contemporary slavery in reference to the temporary foreign worker program. He also said that any person in Canada, regardless of who they employ, needs to treat people with dignity and respect according to the law. And again, this is a problem that's been going on for some time, and they just don't have the enforcement or the inspectors to visit these locations. This is also an abused system, whereas there are employers across the country who will place ads for employment. When people who are residents of Canada apply for it, they are not even contacted for interviews or considered for the positions. Instead, what happens is that they submit reports and the advertisements to the Government of Canada saying that they can't find qualified or willing employees. And this way they can bring in the foreign employees who they can then pay much less and abuse, as this system is full of loopholes and non-compliance is very common. So again, this is an area that works that's covering the hospitality industry, the agriculture industry, the service industry, restaurants, food, just so many areas of the Canadian economy that it's not easy to just say it's in this industry or that. It is rampant throughout the entire economy here in Canada. And I know that it's also an issue in other countries, but the UN has specifically called out Canada in this new report, and I personally think it's about time that it's been brought up at an international level, because too many of these corporations and small farms have been getting away with this for too long. These people deserve to be respected. They deserve to be treated with dignity. And there are people that come regularly from India, from China, from Mexico and other countries to pick produce on farms in the torturing heat. And for them not to be cared for and looked after when they are giving so much for so little is just a travesty in the current labor conditions, to abuse these people like that. It's just not fair. It's not right. And I'm sure you see some of this over in the United Kingdom, Angus.
Yes, it's a massive problem actually here in the UK. Interesting hearing the UN has actually called out Canada, but I'm sure it probably didn't just single out Canada in the past. I think most Western nations, particularly here in Europe, we've experienced this very issue, and it is actually one of the driving forces behind a lot of the immigration debates that we have over here. There is, I would say, across the Western world, amongst our society, there are those employers who take advantage of the situation, and of course, driven by economics. They, of course, look at immigrant labour as cheap labour. It is very easy to bring in cheap immigrant labour and pay them a lot less wages. And there are many of these employers, particularly on the private contractor side, I would say, less so on the corporate side, because of course the corporations are a little bit more accountable, have to be a little bit more transparent in their operations. But certainly here in the UK, and I'm sure the same in Canada, there are lots and lots of private contractors, particularly in the agricultural sectors, the construction sectors, who use these cheap immigrants for labour, for hard labour, pay them very low wages, and of course they get away with much I would say a lot of ignoring a lot of the HSE, the health and safety executive regulations, the laws designed to protect workers, to protect the lives and safety of workers. These are flouted on regular occasions. We've had many, many examples, certainly here in the UK, of immigrant labour that have suffered dreadful injuries and of course deaths because of flouting HSE rules, health and safety rules. There was a great case, that's the wrong word, there was certainly a very high profile case a number of years ago here in the UK in one of our huge estuaries, a very dangerous tidal estuary, and there were about 20 or 30 Chinese immigrants who were employed on very, very low wages, minimum wages, to go and collect cockles, that's shellfish, out in the estuary, and they were caught by this rising tide. This is very well known as an extraordinarily dangerous area to walk in because the tide rises so quickly. And I think 20-something of these Chinese immigrant labourers died. They lost their lives suddenly as the tide swept in faster, literally, than they could run. And that highlighted this very case here in the UK. So yeah, we do have this issue, and there are many, many contractors in industry who take advantage of this. They bring in immigrants, they bring in cheap foreign labour, and they use and abuse these labour. And of course, these poor people suffer the consequences of this. Dubai is a prime example of this, particularly for Indians. You only need to travel around Dubai and see the Indian construction workers who live under the most appalling conditions. They're paid the most appalling wages. They have to work in the most dangerous circumstances, and that has always been a big story, just for particularly of relevance to India. So yes, James, it's a very relevant story, this, and unfortunately it is a tragic story that spans across the Western world. Cheap immigrant labour, and the real sufferers are those poor immigrant labourers who are used and abused. So, wow.
Yeah, and one thing that I would love to see, whether it's in Canada, the US, the UK and such, is when foreign laborers are brought in, or foreign workers are brought into the country, that we have a video or some type of a workshop that they can be, or actually that's mandatory for them to participate in, that explains their rights, that explains the process and how to file complaints, and then quicker and more forceful ramifications for the problems, but also penalties for the employers that fail to comply or take retaliatory action against whistleblowers. So I think that would go a long way to make sure people understood their rights and to save lives, essentially, because we've covered this before in the fact of how many Indians are killed in foreign countries as well, and not taken care of properly or expatriated back to their homeland. So.
Yeah, and of course there is a knock-on effect of all this on countries' economies as well, because of course employers who use this cheap immigrant labour, and this is what's fueling a lot of these anti-immigration problems, certainly here in the UK and in Europe, is that the stock arguments of the far right is, oh, they're coming over here taking our jobs. Well, actually, in practice, many of them are, because these nefarious employers are bringing in, particularly, for example, in the agricultural sectors, bringing in cheap labour. And of course, they're not following the health and safety regulations, and it's expensive to follow health and safety regulations. And of course, these regulations are designed to protect employees. It's designed to look after them, to make sure they don't suffer dreadful accidents and things like this. And of course, if you're an employer abusing the system, why would you pay a high wage to, for example, here in the UK, to a British citizen when you can just ship in somebody from Eastern Europe or China or Russia or wherever, or India, and flout the rules, pay them a low wage, and of course it has allowed employers to flood in these people from overseas, which has of course generated a lot of this anger. So yeah, it's a multilateral problem. It's not just simple slavery, it's the knock-on effect that it has on society as a whole. It's creating all sorts of problems. So yeah, it's a bigger story than we realise, this one, James.
Absolutely. And so, as I said, we've touched on it before, and we will follow up again with it to see if anything changes with this report. So we'll move on to the next story, and that has to do with the increase of hate crime in Canada and the pending report from last year. Right now, I just wanted to cover some of the areas that have increased over the last 5 years. This report actually came out just a few months ago, although it is from the statistical year of 2022. The government is not known for their speed and their expediency in getting reports out to the public or gathering the information. And that's something that maybe they could look at, having some type of an automated system where when it's hate crimes or any crime, that it automatically goes into a centralized database. I mean, we have this technology now that it should be almost real time in terms of these statistics and figures, instead of being a year to a year and a half behind. So as I said, the 2023 statistics are coming out over the next few weeks. They're expected. And I wanted to bring up some areas that we've seen increase over the last 5 years, and that we anticipate will probably be much higher this year than they have been in the past. So of course, the essential, or the introduction here, is that the number of hate crimes reported by police in Canada rose from 3,355 incidents in 2021 to over 3,576 in 2022, which is a 7% increase. Two sharp annual increases resulted in a cumulative rise of 83% from 2019 to 2022. So that's a big jump within only a few years. During the pandemic, there were reductions in certain crimes, but in Canada, the US, and I'm not sure about the UK, but I know in Canada and the US, there was actually an increase in murders and violent crimes. So I don't know if that was primarily domestic or if it was overall, given the crazy attitude and atmosphere in the world at the time. The higher numbers of hate crimes targeting a race or ethnicity is something that's very alarming. It's up 12% to 1,950 incidents, and sexual orientation is also up 12%. Now, they also base some of the statistics on various indicators. So it's, again, lifestyle, religion, and race. But religion and race are actually in a separate column. And the reason why is because with religion, of course, people can be of one race but worship a different religion. So that's why it's broken down in those terms. So I have a few numbers in front of me here that I'm going to bring up on the screen, and I'll just cover those briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on each area because there's a lot to look at here and a lot in this report. Again, you can find this at the Stats Canada or Statistics Canada website when you look at the crime index. Just search that on the Government of Canada website. But as you can see here, when you combine religion, which is the red, and race or ethnicity, which is the blue, you can see that that accounts for almost, all of the violent crimes that are hate-based. Once again, it's differentiated, the red for religion, the blue for race or ethnicity. So even religion is not as hate driven for crime as race is versus religion. So as we scroll down, you can see in the overall areas of Canada where a lot of that is happening. So for British Columbia, here at the bottom of this chart, it is quite concerning because there is such a huge jump in the population in Ontario and Quebec versus the population in British Columbia. So that is, of course, concerning that there is so much hate-driven crime in British Columbia. All of their provinces, especially our three main ones, being British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, have a very multicultural mix of people, and this is very concerning that British Columbia is up so far in terms of the rates per 100,000 people, so the per capita incidence of hate crimes. Okay, so this chart here, this graph that we're looking at now, is basically a descriptor of the types of crimes that have been on the increase, or just the types of crimes that are reported when it comes to hate-based or racism and so forth. Now, general mischief basically are minor offenses that don't really fit into the categories of other chargeable offenses. When you look down, you can see, though, that violent crime and other uttering threats, these types of issues are on the rise. They are definitely the bigger numbers, which is concerning because there are the threats, but also the follow through, because right underneath you can see common assaults, and then there are further more serious related assaults and such that follow down below. So these are very big concerns here in Canada that we're probably seeing in other countries around the world as well, like the US and the UK, especially with the various protests and civil unrest that we see throughout these areas. I also think that it has a lot to do with the political unrest and the political climate in North America and other places that is also feeding into this unrest and this narrative that people are to be feared if they're different from ourselves, which is so ridiculous that we really need to get past that. The next chart here, and the last major one that I really wanted to bring up, was the number of crimes as it relates to the different ethnicities. Now, you can see that Black individuals are the most likely to be the victims of hate crimes in Canada. And again, there's the different years here, but you can see that in 2022, there was a huge jump here over the other previous years. And essentially, one of the things that is next for the next in line in terms of numbers was the East and Southeast Asian community. Now, there was actually a drop in that area between 2021 and 2022, which is a good sign in that year, but I have a very heavy suspicion that we're going to see that number change because of all of the narratives that have been pushed online from people that are just, feeding into this fury of hatred towards immigration. And it's unfortunate that this year it seems to go in waves, and people are targeting, I believe, the Sikhs and Indians this year more than they have in the past when it comes to the online racism and bigotry that's being pushed on those areas. Here, in terms of the hate crimes by religion, was interesting that the Jewish community seems to be the most targeted. And that probably has a lot to do with what's going on in Israel and Palestine and other areas. But again, it is just a horrible thing to see. I mean, look at the number disparity from the next group. And I'm not saying that everybody should be racially targeted equally. I'm saying that it's ridiculous that people are still in this day and age being targeted for race, for religious beliefs, or for just lifestyle. So really, it's really a sad state where we are at this point. Again, their new numbers for 2023 will be out in the next few days, the next few weeks, and we'll look at those as well. But the last point I wanted to raise is that people accused of hate crime are most often men and boys. So parents out there, talk to your children, and also be aware of your own attitudes and your own words in how they're being perceived by your children. And let's try to come together instead of just this continued divisive attitude that we're seeing online and offline these days. Angus, I'm sure that you're seeing the same sort of trends in the UK.
Yes, it's a very interesting report, this. And I think just that final point, just to cover that one, men and boys being the primary perpetrators of this, I don't think that's surprising. It's testosterone driven primarily. There's an obvious genetic difference between men and women, and men seem to be driven more by hatred than women for obvious reasons. Yes, I think we have had a very, very similar story here in the UK. And it's interesting seeing the parallels in terms of the trends, just the overall larger trends. And in fact, I was just going to, I've just called up some statistics that I reported on, I think a few weeks ago. And you talked about the dated nature of these statistics. Yeah, there is unfortunately always a lag in these statistics. It does seem to take an awful long time for these statistics to be collated and correlated and put together and then reported. But still, yeah, it's very interesting to see what's happened. And I'll give you the similar statistics that are almost comparable here in the UK. And this was reported in a report that was put together in 2020, just at the end of 2020, so about three and a half years ago. And it was the report into anti-Sikh hate crimes here in the UK by an all-party parliamentary group for British Sikhs, and it was a group made up of people from different political parties to talk about this very issue. And they reported after they commissioned some research, and they said, for example, that in 2016, this is 8 years ago, 21% or 1 in 5 Sikhs in the UK had experienced hate crimes in the last 12 months. That had risen. Now, between 2016 and 2019, there was a 50% increase in those hate crimes. And approaching the same date of your report, hate crimes were up 8%. I think your report reported 7%. So again, a very similar trend here in the UK. Interestingly, comparable to other religions here in the UK, in the around about 2020, religious hate crimes had actually fallen, strangely enough, against Muslims by 12.5%. And actually Jews by 9.3%, which actually goes contrary to what you've seen in Canada. For some reason, there must be some local issue there. But had increased for Sikhs here in the UK by 7.3%. Again, very, very closely mirroring the same in Canada. And then the increase last year was a staggering 61% for the Sikh community. And interestingly, and I think again mirrored in your stats, 85% of respondents to the investigation done here claim not to have reported hate crimes to the police because basically 8 out of 10 said they said there was no point in reporting it. So it does highlight, and I bet Canada has exactly the same issues as we have here in the UK, is that firstly, a lot of people don't report them because they think, well, what's the point? Nobody seems to care, nobody seems to report them. And so what we've done here, the initiative that was taken here in the UK was to, let's try and get these crimes reported more clearly and more factually so that data can be collected. Because, of course, you can't deal with the problem unless you actually have factual data and specific data. So what they've done here in the UK is, firstly, it was very fundamental. What actually is a hate crime and what is an anti-Sikh hate crime? And they had to come up with a simple definition, and that is the definition they came up with, anti-Sikh hate crime. Yeah. And then, of course, how is it recorded and where it is recorded to, etc. etc. So the whole process and protocol was established here in the UK, and in fact was even farmed out to some of the Sikh organisations to actually help the government collate this data and then present it in suitable forms upon which then action could be taken. So yeah, it's very interesting that I think the trends seem to be mirrored either side of the Atlantic. I'll probably bet it'll be the same in the US and across other Western nations. But I think the fact that these crimes are now being identified more clearly and more specifically, action can be taken. Unfortunately, the trend is in the wrong direction, but I suspect that we may be able to turn this around now that the problem has been identified more clearly, and secondly, then that appropriate action can be taken. I think the West is becoming more and more sensitive to these issues, despite the fact that hatred is still being stirred up, particularly against the Sikh community from India, and the right wing, of course, being used as a tool by Hindutva. I suspect now that Western law enforcement, that the Western governments and those involved in these sorts of things are much, much more aware of the outside influence coming into the West. And I think they are now being able to treat and act against this in a much more effective way. So hopefully we'll see these trends reversing in the foreseeable future. So thanks for that, James. Interesting story.
Thanks, Angus. I wish we had a silver bullet solution, but unfortunately it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of commitment.
Indeed. Okay, let's take a look at my first story. Excuse me. And one of our high-profile Sikh MPs, the members of Parliament, Preet Gill, has written an article, and a very interesting article. I would say it's a very typical political article, but she's written an article that's been highlighted on Baz's website. Preet Gill, she was our first female Sikh MP, and she's had a great career for the Labour Party. She is now in the party of government, and as a result, she's written an opinion piece which has hit the headlines now. And it's, as I said, I would say it's a very typically political article. There's a lot of rhetoric in it, but the message is good and it's clear. And I'll just quickly just run through the key highlights that she mentions. And she said 3 weeks ago, referring, of course, to the election, she watched a new generation of British Sikh MPs swear into Parliament for the first time. And, of course, we'd had that great election result for the Sikh community where, well, she mentions 9, and I think 12 of Sikh origin were eventually elected into Parliament. And she talks about how proud she was and how it reflects the great strides that the Sikh community has made over the years. And she says in 2017 she was honoured to make history as the first Sikh woman to ever be elected to Parliament in the UK, alongside her colleague Tan Desai, the first turbaned Sikh MP. And both of them had a great career actually over the last term of Parliament. And it's nearly a century since the Representation of the People Act gave women the right to vote. I mean, gosh, that's quite shocking, really. After a long, hard campaign by suffragettes, including her own hero, the Sikh Princess Sophia Duleep Singh. And it was her honour to carry that baton into a second century for the franchise for women. Now, of course, after the last election, in which Labour achieved this, what she called a stunning victory for the first time in 19 years, unfortunately, I would slightly temper that enthusiasm by saying it was more a case of the Conservatives, after their dreadful 14 years, probably gifted government to the Labour Party. But anyway, but she says no less than 9 new MPs of Sikh descent enter our Parliament, and it gives us proportional representation of Sikhs for the first time. So she is highlighting the fact that Sikhs have finally got a much more powerful voice in British politics at last. Now, she says, in my community, we used to talk about Canada, which was well ahead of us in Sikh political representation, despite their migration coming much later. Now it finally feels like we have arrived as well. And of course, James, we do talk a lot about Canadian politics. And of course, you have a Sikh MP, a Sikh leader of one of your key political parties. So, of course, Canada has been far ahead of the UK. And Preet talks about that when she was growing up, she refers back to, I would say, almost the dark days of British society, particularly for immigrants in the 70s and the 80s. And she talks about when she grew up, people like me, Sikhs, weren't on TV. Our stories weren't told in history books or at school. In fact, we weren't really represented in British culture at all. And she talks about one of our biggest cities, Birmingham. And she grew up in Birmingham in the 1980s, and she talked about the distrust and division between the communities spilling into the streets. And she couldn't imagine the progress that we have made since. And she's absolutely right. I mean, the UK is such a different nation now, and how multicultural, what a multicultural success in many areas it has become. And she says it's important that our legislature is slowly coming to look more like the people it serves. So she is talking that Parliament is now filling up with more and more proportional representation for our ethnic minorities. And it's not only a powerful symbol of progress, but it's also an opportunity to break down these barriers that are holding others like her back. She talks a lot about her father, the late Daljit Singh Shergill, who drove her into politics. He came into the UK when he was just 15 years old. He was part of that diaspora coming into the UK. And she talks about how difficult, and of course many of our correspondents, our commenters have talked about how difficult it was in those days coming to the UK. Getting a job was difficult. Discrimination, of course, was much more overt. But one thing Britain gave him was opportunity, the chance at an education so he could change his life. Slowly, he and others rooted themselves in their community in the West Midlands. He unionised the workers at his factory to stop ethnic workers from having their pay packets stolen. He himself, this is her father, established the Guru Nanak Gurdwara in Smethwick, where I still go to pray to this day. Previously a church, he liked that this was a place of God and always strove to maintain that interfaith ethos. Back then, he wouldn't expect the state to look out for us, so we had to build these institutions for ourselves. And of course, this refers to how so many of our diaspora Sikhs and of course other ethnic minorities have built such great successful lives here in Britain and contributed so much to British society. And she says, brick by brick, that generation laid the foundations for the next. How true that is. And she talks about her father's strong sense of community and belief in the power of local politics and how it's influenced everything that she does. We should never forget what the generations that blazed a trail before us have overcome. Our success is theirs as much as our own. She talks about how new Sikh MPs began their journeys in Parliament. The mark of our progress is no longer just as leaders in our communities, but as leaders of the country. Now, this is where it gets really significant because, of course, Sikhs now entering Parliament, they're not just leaders in their community. They are now actually taking the Sikh issues into British popular culture, into British politics. They're actually having an influence in overall British political policy. So how important is that? And she talks about the hard work of progress isn't over, but this is a Britain that is a world away from what they lived through in the 70s and 80s. And this is why it falls to our generation, her generation, to continue their work on other issues like the Sikh ethnic tick box campaign. Of course, that refers to the hate crimes we've been talking about, recognising the Sikh community in our census, as we don't actually have a tick box to recognise how many Sikhs we have here in the UK. She talks about tackling anti-Sikh hate and championing various human rights causes. And then she talks about wanting our daughters to inherit our diverse multicultural Britain, defined by our values of hard work, community, live and let live, and fair play, where anyone can achieve what they want to, held back by nothing, etc., etc. She does talk, there's a lot of political rhetoric here, etc., etc. She refers to the riots and how these riots were, of course, an extremist minority. They do not represent the vast majority of British people who do welcome our multicultural society. And she talks about this week in the news, their week in the news will pass. They will face justice for their crimes. And I say to those Sikhs who rightly worry about the targeting of their communities, remember these destructive forces do not represent Britain. We do. Absolutely right. And she talks about only a month ago, communities as diverse as Huddersfield to Loughborough. These are some of our communities across the Midlands and the north of the UK, voted for a Sikh to be their voice in Parliament for the first time. This is the first time in these constituencies that Sikhs have actually been elected. The forces of racial hatred and division won't win because, in a sense, they've already lost. They do not speak for the Britain that she knows and loves. And now that we have 12 Sikh voices in Parliament working together across lines of faith, ethnicity and even politics to serve our communities and speak for everyone we represent, it gives her new hope For that better Britain, we must continually renew and build. So yeah, it's a very positive statement from Preet Kaur Gill. She's been in Parliament for a number of years now. Her voice has been very powerful. She has stood up very powerfully for, of course, many campaigns, including, of course, the Jaggi campaign and the human rights issues facing Sikhs, and of course her Sikh community here in the UK. So yeah, well done, a huge well done to Preet Kaur Gill, and of course very best of luck to our new Sikh MPs in Parliament. They've got their work cut out. We have been critical, very critical, of the Labour government so far. Unfortunately, their leader, Keir Starmer, and our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, do not seem to have stuck to their promises, do not seem to be as forceful and forthright as they were during the campaigning leading up to the election. They do not seem to be quite as forceful now that they're in power as they were beforehand in protecting the Sikh community. But let's hope our 12 Sikh MPs, their voices at least now wield a little bit more power, that the Sikh community's voice is now heard a lot more powerfully within British politics, James. But of course, you in Canada, how much, as she says, as she admits, Canada is much more advanced politically for the Sikh community.
We would like to think, but let's not go that far. I think that we've still got a long way to go as well. But yeah, we do have an NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, who I would love to see as Prime Minister of Canada, but, we'll have to wait and see next year what happens with that. But I do believe that these individuals that are in Parliament are raising the profile and helping to break down stereotypes. And I'll tell you a quick story. It'll take just a quick second here, and then we'll move on. But when it comes to stereotypes, my son, all my sons are part Japanese. My youngest came to me one day when he was little and said, "Dad, I'm really good at ping pong." And I said, "You've only played once at Uncle John's, and what makes you think that?" He says, "Well, because I was watching TV, and it looks like all the Japanese are really good at it." And what he had seen was some competition or tournament that was going on overseas, and he just assumed because he was Japanese, he must be good at ping pong too. So it just shows how
that is the case, isn't it?
Some stereotypes can start, right?
Well, indeed, but clearly there's something in Japanese water because they are extraordinarily good at ping pong. I don't know what it is.
I think it's their dedication to sport and being good at all things they do, but we'll move on from that. I think that is probably the case. Funny story to share.
Indeed. Okay, let's move on to my second story, and a quick story in India. And this is the story about the Hindu sacred month of Shravan. And strange goings on, because this celebration has taken a bit of a dark turn in recent years for some reason. Now, this sacred month of Shravan honours the god of destruction, Lord Shiva. And in northern India, it's become increasingly associated, unfortunately, with mob violence by saffron-clad devotees. Now, analysts have said that this increase in violence and, unfortunately, the muted response, this is important, it's the muted response to stop it by the authorities, is a reaction to Prime Minister Narendra Modi's Hindu first politics. Now, millions of people mark the month by trekking a long way to collect the holy water from the Ganges River and carry it back home to shrines, celebrating the monsoon rains and new beginnings. That's what it's all about. Many are young and many are poor, dedicated to their deity, but also partying and taking a break from, of course, their tough day-wage labour for a few rare weeks of fun. They play loud music and they smoke lots of cannabis. Now, they're known as Kanwarias after the bamboo poles across their shoulders that they use to carry the heavy containers of this sacred water from the Ganges. But this year, after the month-long pilgrimage started in late July, lawlessness has apparently surged and the violence has surged. And the pilgrims have been caught many times on camera running riot. And these videos have been shared widely on social media, and they're not fake, they have actually been verified by news agencies. They include, for example, vandalising a fuel station for being asked to stop smoking, violent road rage, leaving passers-by injured badly, and groups of Kanwarias fighting amongst themselves, clearly fuelled by the enthusiasm and the weed that they're smoking. Pilgrims insist that hooliganism is restricted to a few stray incidents, blaming devotees who overindulge in cannabis. But the BJP has boosted support for the travellers. In the country's most populous state, for example, Uttar Pradesh, whose chief minister is a hardline Hindu monk and a key BJP leader, top government officials showered flower petals on the devotees from a helicopter. And that came just days after pilgrims had overturned a government security car. Now, the Modi government has, according to an anthropologist who teaches here in London at a university in London, has said that the Modi government has put across the message that the state is subordinate to the party in power. That's Modi's BJP. Now, many devout Hindus are vegetarians during Shravan, and in several BJP-run states, local administrations ban meat on pilgrim routes. But this year, some have gone a lot further. And this is where Indian politics, which is really a buzz at the moment with this particular policy. 2 state governments have ordered restaurants to display the names of their owners. This is a rule that critics said was deliberately intended to divide restaurants by religion and target minority Muslims. Now, this order was later suspended by the Supreme Court, but this is something that has been debated fiercely, and the right-wing media in India, the Hindutva media, have been really talking about this in a big way, is that this BJP brought in policy that restaurants, cafes, anybody providing food actually has to display the name of the owners, the people who own that restaurant, for all sorts of reasons. But basically, the critics are saying this is deliberately highlighting the ethnicity of that restaurant. It means it's increasing the ability for people to discriminate against the minorities, particularly the Muslims. Now, more and more people are undertaking the pilgrimage because there is a broader climate of encouragement for participation in public religious activities. Popularity has been boosted within the context of underemployed men's activities, as well as a source seeking divine intervention for their precarious economic situation. And a sociologist from the University of Copenhagen said the pilgrimage allows the working class to briefly occupy the centre stage. It's as much an expression of vast class and caste inequalities that shape contemporary India. So there's a lot of issues at play here, but clearly the BJP are quite happy. They are acquiescing. They are allowing these mobs to become violent. Why? One wonders why, but again, there's been a lot of criticism about the governance of India in many ways, not least the increasing violence and lawlessness in many states. And now even Hindus are being encouraged to increase this lawlessness and this violence. What is the end game here? Well, certainly we've talked about increasing violence in many of the peripheral states, like the Punjab and other areas, Manipur, another case in point, is that it's allowing more direct and brutal control, ruthless control. Jammu and Kashmir, another case in point, presidential rule. It's allowing central government to clamp down more violently on these states, and particularly states that are not run by the BJP. Non-BJP states are almost being encouraged to become lawless. The violence to increase allows the BJP to then decry democracy, the democratically elected other parties of these states, and instead the BJP can send in central control, essentially BJP control of these states. So one wonders if there is another agenda at play here. But yeah, lawlessness in India, James, it's on the increase. Unfortunately, again, seems to be driven by inter-community hatred.
And I was stuck on the fact they were motivated to riot and misbehave by cannabis. Obviously, they're not smoking Canadian weed, or they would be laid back on the couch. The only time they expend energy in Canada when they're smoking weed is when the pizza man gets to the door.
Well, exactly, and I do question the whole premise here, because I thought when you smoke weed it was supposed to calm me down, but clearly these people are very, very religiously devoted and encouraged by the contents of this drug.
Yeah, I think they're just smoking the wrong stuff, but whatever.
Indeed, but yeah, no, I think one of the serious issues there has been highlighted in this news press release.
Absolutely.
Was the fact that displaying the names of restaurant owners to the public. I mean, one could argue there is a beneficial point to this, and I'm sure that it was packaged up and marketed as being a good thing, a part of progress. In reality, as the critics have said, it's allowing people to target and discriminate against these ethnic minorities, who, of course, many of the Muslims do run restaurants, as they do here in the UK. And Yeah, it's another element of division happening in India. So
Yeah, and I just think it's a horrible idea to start with. To any business having to publicly display the owner's name, putting the target on the business, on the owner, or on their families. I just don't agree with that in any way for privacy.
yeah, Supreme Court have suspended that, but we will see. Okay, quick one, final story today. Today is, as many will know, Independence Day of India. And a good thing, a bad thing, pluses and minuses on both sides of the account there. But of course, for Sikhs, it was, as many have described, a black day. Now, not only was Independence Day, it's certainly partition, a terrible series of massacres and genocides, in fact. Carnage, many people, hundreds of thousands, millions actually died during the process of partition. And Sikh bodies have decided to mark Indian Independence Day as what they call a Black Day. And they're planning to stage protests at Tarn Taran against injustices, subjugation and excesses unleashed by the current Indian regime. Now, the Shiromani Akali Dal in Amritsar and the Dal Khalsa, these are two major Sikh organisations fighting for, of course, the sovereignty and independence of Punjab, have jointly decided to hold a protest at Tarn Taran today against the authoritarian regime of Modi, against political subjugation and against injustice and the excesses of the regime, particularly against Sikhs. Now, Simranjit Singh Man's son and leader of the SAD, Iman Singh Man, and Dal Khalsa working president Paramjit Singh Man, at a press conference earlier this week, said that hundreds of activists of both parties will take to the streets today at Tarn Taran against the 77 years of injustice and the discrimination of against the Sikh community, and seek the right to self-determination under the United Nations for Punjab. Now, the leaders of both the organisations have said that they are protesting, particularly against the Indian state's interference in the religious affairs of minorities, including Sikhs, the repression on Sikh leaders abroad, double standards in the release of Sikh political prisoners, illegal detention of Sikh youths under these dreadful pieces of legislation, the National Security Act and the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, two pieces of legislation that we have talked about at great length. Interference in religious affairs of minorities, particularly the Sikhs. Watch my podcast release yesterday. We do talk about this a lot, about how India has deliberately infiltrated many of the Sikh religious organisations, the Sikh political organisations. They have put their placemen into these organisations to weaken and dilute the Sikh voice. These people are deliberately put in place. They are essentially puppets of the RSS organisations. They are designed to fragment, to break up and to weaken the Sikh voice and the Sikh organisations. These are the organisations that are there, that exist to try and fight back against this central control and also push the voice for the Sikhs. So do watch that podcast released yesterday with Dr. Sandy. And the organisations are terming today as a black day for Punjab and especially Sikhs. They said, unlike Muslims and Hindus who got their respective nations on the 14th and 15th of August 1947, Sikhs missed the bus. Since then, they're striving for their own independent nation, of course, as we talk about on a regular basis. And it's more stringent than previous ones. We're talking about the leaders raised serious objections on the new criminal laws introduced by Modi. We've talked about these laws. These are the laws that came in about a month ago. These are the evolution from the old British colonial laws. They have been changed fundamentally, but in fact, not just changed fundamentally, they've actually been enhanced. They have been involved into laws that many critics have said these are even worse than we had before. They're increasing the powers of the state. They're allowing any state government that's running out of control to abuse the laws against political dissent, allowing them to detain political prisoners for ridiculously unlawful and undemocratic lengths of time. So lots of fear about the new laws brought in, as well as, and they refer here to archaic sedition laws. And they talk about the old TADA, that was a Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, which was brought in the 1980s and 90s after the rising up of the Punjab and the Sikhs in the Punjab, that dreadful TADA Act, the Tadar Act, was brought in. It was brought in temporarily, but funnily enough, it was then extended and extended and extended until finally the people just said, no, you cannot keep using this draconian piece of legislation. It is being abused by the Indian government. It was finally, because of popular dissent, it was finally repealed. But it's since been replaced by equally dreadful and draconian laws like the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and the National Security Act. These laws which are currently detaining people like Amritpal Singh and many others in prison, and Jagtal Singh Johal as well. And also earlier this week, the Dal Khalsa already held what they called a Freedom March at Hoshiarpur on the occasion of its 46th Foundation Day, and that was, of course, dedicated to Bhai Hardeep Singh Jar, who was assassinated in Canada last year, and of course one of their own founders, the Dal Khalsa, by Gajinder Singh Founder, who passed away in Lahore last month. So lots of activity in the Punjab, James. People are still having a voice. People are, as is typical for the Sikh community, they are not afraid to take to the streets. They are not afraid, fortunately, to raise their voices against Indian oppression, against the Indian government, and say, we are still here. We are still protesting. Our voices will not be silenced despite these dreadful pieces of draconian legislation. We will still march against oppression. The Sikh voice will still be heard.
Well, we had some technical difficulties, but we're back here now. And I think that, again, it is a very important time for people in India and around the world to take that moment to recognize that there is a big failure when it comes to the independence of countries, including India, to recognize the autonomy or the lack of return of property to the Sikhs from the Sikh Empire prior to the control by the British. So it's hopefully it's a great day for all to not only reflect on the successes but also of the failures and how to move the country forward.
Indeed. Right, let us move on now to our comment section as time is marching on. And lots of wonderful comments, as always. Thank you so much to each and every one of you who sent in a comment. And of course, thank you to each and every one of you who watches our show. We never acknowledge enough our audience, but thank you for all of you. Even if you don't leave a comment, thank you for watching. Even if you leave a like, it does help us boost the show on YouTube's weird algorithm. So please do feel free to like, of course, if you like the show. And but do leave a comment, as many of you have done. It does help the algorithm. So, okay, and one of our last shows, Spying on Sikhs, we had this interesting comment, and I put this one up. It was in, I guess, Punjabi. And of course, James and I don't speak Punjabi. We'd have to rely on Google Translate, and this is Google Translate's version. I have no idea how accurate it is. Perhaps some of our Punjabi-speaking audience could comment accordingly, but it was an interesting comment, and it's unfortunate that I couldn't fully understand what it was, but I think the reference here is really interesting, which is why I'm sharing this one up. Because Raoul says Sama does not remain the same. I think Sama means equality, and I think the point here is across India, things are not equal, as we do talk about regularly. And but the point here that I thought was really interesting, Punjabis should join the Chinese army. Let's get these brothers out of Punjab and return to their homes. And I think, if I'm correct in this interpretation, I'm sure our audience will correct me if I'm wrong in our translation here. But this is another person actually arguing, if I understand correctly, for the Khalistan movement should actually ally with China, James. We've had this discussion before. I thought it was a bit of a fringe suggestion, but maybe there are more people than we realise, particularly in the Punjab, who think it is a good idea. Let's not ally with the West, because the West are clearly trying to ally with India, with the Indian government. Let's instead, let's put our flag up the Chinese flagpole, so to speak. Let's join forces with China, who, as we've talked about, we're pretty sure that China would promote Khalistan because it has its own interests at heart. It would certainly suit China. But is it in Khalistan's best interest to align with China? Personally, I don't think so, but clearly there are many Sikhs who do think so. What do you think, James?
I agree that a lot of people think that, but I just, we've talked about this before, and I just don't see the benefit, because I just don't feel that China could be trusted to actually back the Sikhs, and they'd be in the same position they're in with India now, that they're setting themselves up for failure. So that's my opinion anyway.
Yeah, and certainly in my experience in the past, I spent a lot of time in West Africa, and I saw the Chinese operate in West Africa, particularly countries like Angola as a prime example, where the excuse me, the Chinese are very happy to invest huge amounts of money, massive amounts of money. And of course, money is always very welcome everywhere. And essentially, they're buying influence. They have essentially that donation, that investment always comes with a price. It always comes with a sting in the tail, a hook, because it's all very well accepting this money. And if Khalistan accepts China's money, there's always a price attached to it. And that price, more often than not, is control. So I would stand that very much as a warning to any other Khalistanis who think that China is a better option than the West, is just be aware, Chinese money always comes with a very, very heavy price, and that is usually control. Now, Nirmal Singh refers to the Hindutva major, the YouTube Major Arya, who we talked about yesterday, who quite often on his YouTube show is quite vocal, quite vociferous and quite offensive in many ways, calling for violence, as he often does, against Khalistanis particularly, but certainly against the Sikh community. He's very vocal and very encouraging of criminals even. He even suggests that criminals should attack Khalistanis across the diaspora. And Nirmal Singh says Arya should be jailed for good. He's a stirrer and a coward. He should be jailed by his Modi brother, Khalistan Zindabad. Well, unfortunately, I don't think Mr. Modi is ever going to jail Major Arya, because one wonders if Major Arya is actually a spokesperson for the RSS. Clearly he is. He's clearly a Hindutva stooge. Now, whether or not he should be jailed for good, we are believers in the rule of law. Now, I think we also believe in the freedom of speech. And ironically, actually, James, and here's an interesting angle to this argument. I would not jail Major Arya for good. Now, he has incited violence. Now, that crosses a line here in Western democracies. Yes, that is a criminal offence. So if he was here in the UK or Canada, yes, he would face a criminal charge. He wouldn't be locked up for good. I would disagree with that. But he certainly should be criminally punished. But I still respect his ability, his freedom of speech. I respect his ability to offend me, to offend Sikhs. We must not be so sensitive that we cannot be offended. But when it crosses the line into criminal incitement to violence, that's different. So again, James, we're back onto the old freedom of speech argument.
And I think that we've established well over the program's history here that we both agree very much on those principles.
Indeed, which is why actually I am more than happy to put up here in our comments section critics, because I don't mind critics. They have a freedom of expression. Even if they hate the show, even if they're offended by me or want to offend me, please, by all means, call us monkeys, as I think one of our critics did the other day. I am not offended really by that, but I respect your freedom of speech to post that up. And we have a right to be offended, and you have a right to be offensive, as long as it doesn't cross the criminal threshold.
And sometimes we learn something from the critics too, so.
Indeed. Right, Jasleen, one of our regular commenters, has made a comment, and this refers again back to the distinction that some commenters have made between Sikhs and Khalistanis. Of course, there is a bit of a running commentary here from many of our provocateurs who say, if you're a real Sikh, you're not a Khalistani. And saying that Khalistanis are not real Sikhs. And this, of course, has ignited a lot of comments, a lot of debates amongst our comment section. And Jasleen has come out very, very sensibly and saying that actually there is a tiny minority of Sikhs who do not see themselves as Khalistanis. And they have accepted this perpetual struggle, as she calls it, to essentially give up their basic rights to live in the Indian autocracy, because they've actually been seduced by the materialistic side of life. They've been seduced by, some of the benefits that the Indian government have. But the price of that, of course, is servitude. And we talked in many of our podcasts, for example, about this Stockholm syndrome, as we call it. It's where, as a captive, and the lower castes have almost become victims of this too, they have become captives of the Indian state. They don't realise this perpetual slavery that they are living in. And maybe, and I think that the argument here is that these people, the Sikhs, have become captives themselves of this seductive Indian state, and they're not realising that they have become captives of this. And Modi Drink Moot follows this comment up with a very simple premise that every real Sikh who practices his religion or her religion is, of course, a Khalistani, just by the very nature of what Sikhi stands for. The entire land of Punjab is filled with the blood of the sacrifices made by Sikhs. Of course it is, particularly throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And otherwise, you'll just send us back 500 years in mentality. Every kid that we give birth to will be a Khalistani by nature, almost by genetics, James. So yeah, I think our commenters are very clear here, and on the whole, aligned to the fact that if you're a genuine Sikh, then almost by nature of being a Sikh and the philosophy of Sikhi, you are in essence a Khalistani.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen how the referendum is there for people to vote yes or no. It's not there for only the yes side. So everybody has that freedom of, the right to speak and the right to opinions to vote either way they want.
Well, I think that's right, and we keep calling for India to hold its referendum in Punjab. What are you afraid of? Let people, if you honestly think that there are so many Sikhs who are genuinely against Khalistan, then hold that referendum. Let's see what the facts are. You can't have an argument or a discussion or a debate without facts. So we must rush through our final set of comments, and 1S1N2 has said the best, most humanitarian Hindus support Khalistan. Why wouldn't they? Khalistan would bring prosperity and equality and justice to all its citizens. Now, this in itself actually provoked a very interesting debate. Lynn NIL said, "Sir, I'm from Uttarakhand, and I'm sorry for what happened with Sikhs throughout the independence era. I pray to God," and then there's, I think, a bit of Punjabi there, "I will forever support Sikhs until death." Joe Bolli Sonihal, etc. And our resident provocateur S. Simba comes in. "There is prosperity and equality in all parts of India. I live in Ludhiana. Where do you live?" Now, I think the premise of this debate, certainly to start with, was that actually there are many in India, not just Sikhs, who would support Khalistan because of the philosophy of what Khalistan stands for. And of course, we always refer back to the Sikh Empire of the 19th century and how successful the Sikh Empire was, because it wasn't just a Sikh empire as such. It wasn't just a Sikh nation. It was a nation that was welcome to all faiths, all creeds, all religions, on all backgrounds and all ethnicities even. It was stood up at the time as a prime ideological example of how successful a multi-faith nation could be and how peaceful it was. And so, of course, this comment is saying, look, of course, there will be many Hindus who would support Khalistan and everything it stands for. And unfortunately, I can't show up the rest of this thread, and it's almost an appeal. But there were some really, really interesting comments that followed these. But they were in broken English and a lot of Punjabi. But I did manage to pick out pieces which it actually turned into a very larger geopolitical discussion, which I think had some very interesting comments and some very interesting ideas. Unfortunately, I don't know whether this was because the commenters, their English was not good enough, but there was just enough English in there amongst the Punjabi to give me a real teasing flavour of how fascinating that discussion was. So, if I may plead and ask in the most humblest way, if you have comments like this, do make them as best as you can in English, even in broken English, but in your best English, because I think there were some fascinating discussions that were coming out in there that unfortunately James and I couldn't read. James, that's frustrating, isn't it?
Maybe they're calling us monkeys again, I don't know.
I think probably, yeah, there's probably some rude comments in there that maybe we are better not knowing. So user BT something or other said, "Great programme you guys bring to us." Well, thank you. Great comments. Keep up the great reporting about the RSS nutters running India. Simple comment. I can't add to that. Absolutely. The RSS nutters running India. And Gurdev Singh says, blesses us, thank you, for both showing the actual facts regarding Hindu TV racist government. Absolutely, we talk about India is now, I think, the 159th out of 183 countries in the World Free Press Index. It is a shameful statistic that proves that Hindu TV is indeed not free, that is not a free press. India does not enjoy a free press. And excuse me, Gurpreet, with our final comment of the day, beg your pardon, there are a few more. Gurpreet wraps up her comments of the day to say, I love your show so much, thank you. And I put this comment up. I always wait eagerly for it after the weekend, and every morning I check my phone a few times to see if you've uploaded it. Please don't mind people who make nasty comments. We don't. We absolutely love the nasty comments. Don't worry, we have a thick skin. We can take it. The reason I showed this comment was actually just to explain our process to our audience, because I know some of you, fortunately, do await eagerly our shows, our daily shows. And the one comment I wanted is just to explain how our process works at our side, so you can plan around when to look for our shows. We record these shows usually in the early morning UK time, which is a ridiculous time in Canada for poor James. It's the very small hours for James in Canada. And then as soon as we finish recording, the show is edited. It does take a few hours to edit. And usually there are lots of technical hiccups, lots of problems, as is always the case with these sorts of things. It's a long show with a lot of editing to do. But usually we tend to upload it round about mid-afternoon UK time. So I think in India time, Punjab time, that will probably be late evening, sort of round about 9, 10ish at night approximately. Sometimes it is a little bit later due to problems. So that's the time frame which these shows are uploaded to YouTube. So I hope that helps some of our viewers when to look out for. And of course, the structure usually is Monday to Thursday we have our Perspective show, and Friday we release the podcast, the weekly podcast show. And again, that is usually, sometimes that's released slightly earlier onto the YouTube channel. So I hope that helps our audience in terms of when to look out for the shows.
Oh.
And final set of comments, Knockdown. Says, democracy with millions of rapes, millions of innocent minorities and Dalits lose lives every year due to racism or discrimination. The Supreme Court decisions are based on majority population sentiment, no matter proof or not, saying that the Supreme Court decisions aren't even made on the normal rule of law. They are influenced by outside influence, political influence. The majority of Indians live in the fairy tale stories without any facts. Goon politicians lead crowds and mobs, always ready to run over anyone who dares to speak against them. I think this, in a nutshell, James, summarises the problem of India. India that claims it's a democracy. Here, I think, in one very simple comment, just wraps up all the reasons why one can argue that India is no longer a democracy.
Right. And something that we've talked about time and time again.
It is indeed. It is indeed. So thank you for that comment. Final comment of the show. Gurvinder Sond says, UK Labour not helping the Sikh community. We've talked about this to a great extent. Preet Gill, her article, as we covered today, clearly she is doing her best as part of the UK Labour government. She and her colleagues are doing the best for the Sikh community. So full force to them. The problem here is the leadership. As we have talked about, is the UK Labour leadership really standing up for the Sikh community? I will leave that up to our Sikh viewers and our Sikh community to make their decision based on your own experience. I unfortunately have got my feelings about it, but you people are at the front end of this. You people are the ones who will be directly affected by this. You let me know how you feel about it. Clearly, Govinda has got this person's feelings about it made very clear. But there, we're over time as usual. We must wrap things up, but we must bring Perspectives to a close. Don't forget to keep those comments coming in. Thank you so much for all your comments, as I do say every day. They are very much appreciated. We read every single one of them. Yes, even the nasty ones. We do appreciate them all. So do keep them coming. Don't forget you can email us directly, as many as of you have done, at message at satellagetv.com if you've got anything that you'd like to bring to our attention. But in the meantime, you have been watching Perspectives. It is a goodbye from me, and it is a goodbye from James.
Stay safe, everyone.
You have, of course, been watching Perspectives. We will see you next time.